Arif adjusted the rearview mirror to glance at the old man, whose hands trembled as he pulled his tattered shawl tighter around himself. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, the kind that told stories of hardship and years spent battling life's unforgiving trials. "Where to, Uncle?" Arif asked, his voice gentle. The old man hesitated, staring outside as if lost in thought. Then, in a barely audible voice, he murmured, "To the other side of the city, near the hospital." Arif nodded and started the engine, the low hum of the car filling the quiet space between them. The streets were still alive with flashing neon signs and groups of people rushing home, but inside the cab, there was an unusual silence. Arif wasn't one to ask personal questions, but something about this old man intrigued him. Why was he out so late, all alone, with no money for a ride? Was no one looking after him? He stole another glance in the mirror. The old man was staring outside, his eyes glistening, his lips moving slightly as if whispering prayers. Arif cleared his throat. "Uncle, if you don't mind me asking, do you have family in the city?" The old man exhaled deeply, his frail shoulders sinking. "I used to," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But life has a strange way of separating people. Sometimes by distance, sometimes by time, and sometimes by fate." Arif frowned but didn't press. He understood the weight of unspoken pain. The car moved steadily through the streets, the yellow glow of streetlights flashing in intervals. The heater inside the cab was on, but Arif could still feel the chill that clung to the old man. After a few minutes, the old man suddenly spoke again. "I wasn't always like this, you know." His voice was steadier now, laced with a quiet pride. "There was a time when I had a home, a family, and enough wealth to never worry about a single meal." Arif's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He had met many passengers over the years, heard countless stories of riches to rags, fate's cruel twists. But this man, there was something different about him. "What happened?" Arif asked cautiously. The old man gave a wry smile, his gaze still lost in the passing cityscape. "I trusted the wrong people," he said after a moment, "and I lost everything." Arif didn't know what to say. He wasn't a stranger to struggle, but the weight of losing everything, that was a pain he couldn't even begin to imagine. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Then, suddenly, the old man chuckled, a low, bitter sound. "You must think I'm just another beggar, telling a sob story for sympathy." Arif shook his head. "No, Uncle, I don't think that at all." The old man turned his eyes toward Arif, his gaze sharp despite his frail appearance. "Then why did you agree to drive me, knowing I have nothing to pay you with?" Arif hesitated. He didn't have a concrete answer. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was respect for an elder. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the simple belief that kindness, even in small amounts, still mattered in this world. "I don't know," Arif admitted finally. "It just felt like the right thing to do." The old man studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Not many people think that way anymore. The word stung. Arif had seen enough selfishness in the world to know they were true. But as he drove through the dimly lit streets, he also knew that sometimes kindness had a way of coming back. Sometimes when you least expected it. What Arif didn't know was that tonight, his kindness was about to change his life forever. The ride continued in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the cab. Arif's mind drifted as he navigated through the quiet streets, still wondering about the old man's story. He had met passengers from all walks of life, but something about this man felt different, like there was a storm hidden beneath his calm exterior. As they approached a quieter part of the city, Arif finally spoke again. "Uncle, this hospital you're going to, is someone waiting for you there?" The old man's lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his worn shawl. After a long pause, he answered, "Not exactly." Arif frowned but didn't press further. The hospital wasn't far now, and soon, his role in this man's journey would be over. But fate had other plans. A few minutes later, Arif slowed the car as they neared a dimly lit street. Something felt off. The hospital was still a few blocks away, but the old man suddenly shifted forward in his seat. "Stop here," he said abruptly. Arif blinked. "Here? But the hospital is still." Please, Beta. Just here. Confused, Arif pulled over. The street was almost empty, lined with closed shops and shuttered buildings. The only movement came from a stray dog sniffing around for food near a trash bin. The old man reached for the door handle, his hands shaking. Arif noticed it right away. Uncle, are you sure you'll be okay? The old man nodded weakly, but Arif wasn't convinced. Wait, Arif said, hesitating before reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the last of his cash, just a few crumpled notes, barely enough to cover his fuel for tomorrow's shift. Take this. Maybe it'll help you get something warm to eat. The old man's eyes widened in surprise. Son, I can't take this from you. Please, Arif insisted. I don't have much, but... Before he could finish, the old man reached out and placed a frail hand on Arif's. His touch was light, but there was an odd strength in it, as if he had seen too much, endured too much, and knew something Arif didn't. Bless you, Beta, the old man murmured. You don't know what you've done for me tonight. Arif felt an odd chill run down his spine, but he brushed it off. The old man finally stepped out, pulling his shawl tightly around himself. For a second, he just stood there, looking at Arif like he wanted to say something more. But then he simply nodded and turned away, slowly disappearing into the shadows. Arif sat in his car for a moment, watching him go. Something didn't feel right, but he couldn't explain why. With a sigh, he shook his head and turned the car back toward home. The night was over. Or so he thought. An hour later, Arif was home, exhausted but relieved to finally be with his family. His wife, Amina, was already in the kitchen, and their 2 young children were playing in the small living room. The sight warmed his heart. Did you bring the milk? Amina called out. Arif scratched the back of his head sheepishly. About that. Before he could explain, his phone buzzed loudly in his pocket. He frowned. It was almost midnight. Who would be calling him now? He pulled out his phone. An unknown number. Hello? Arif answered, already bracing for some late-night prank call. A deep voice came through the other end. Is this Arif, the cab driver? Arif stiffened. Yes, who's this? There was a pause. Then, the voice continued. We need you to come back to the hospital. Immediately. Arif's heart skipped a beat. The hospital? Why? It's about an old man, the voice said. A very important man. And you were the last person seen with him. Arif's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. The old man. What had happened to him? He grabbed his keys without a second thought. I'm on my way. As he rushed out the door, Amina called after him, worried. Arif, what's wrong? I don't know, he muttered. But I need to find out. With his heart pounding, he jumped into his cab and sped off into the night, unaware that what awaited him would change his life forever. Arif gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing as he sped toward the hospital. The streets, now mostly empty, stretched endlessly before him, the glow of streetlights flickering like distant stars. A strange sense of unease settled in his chest. Why were they looking for me? The old man's frail figure flashed in his mind. His trembling hands, the sadness in his voice, the weight of unspoken words. Arif's gut told him that something was terribly wrong. As he pulled up to the hospital entrance, he barely had time to park before a well-dressed man in a dark suit approached him. His face was serious, his expression unreadable. Are you Arif, the cab driver? The man asked. Yes, Arif replied, stepping out of the car. What's going on? Where's the old man? The man studied him for a moment before gesturing toward the hospital doors. Follow me. Arif's pulse pounded in his ears as he followed the man through the brightly lit corridors. Nurses moved about quickly, doctors consulted charts, but none of them seemed aware of the turmoil building inside him. They finally stopped outside a private room. Through the small glass window, Arif could see the old man lying on a hospital bed, an oxygen mask over his face. His eyes were open, but he looked even weaker than before. A doctor stood beside him, checking his vitals. Arif turned to the man in the suit. What happened to him? The man sighed. He collapsed shortly after you dropped him off. A passerby saw him and called for help. Arif swallowed hard, guilt creeping into his chest. I should have stayed. I knew something was wrong. The man continued, "But that's not why we called you." Arif frowned. "Then why?" The man hesitated before saying, "Because he asked for you." Arif's breath hitched. "Me?" The man nodded. "He refuses to speak to anyone else," he said. "You are the only person he trusts." Arif's legs felt weak, but he forced himself to step forward as the door was pushed open. Inside the room, the old man turned his head slowly toward Arif. A faint smile formed on his lips. "You came," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Arif pulled a chair closer and sat beside him. "Uncle, what's going on? Why did you ask for me?" The old man took a shaky breath. "Because you were kind to me when you had no reason to be." Arif shook his head. "That doesn't explain why I'm here." The old man's tired eyes locked onto his. "Because I don't have much time left, Beta. And before I go, I need to make things right." A chill ran down Arif's spine. "Make things right? What do you mean?" The old man reached for his bedside table with trembling fingers and picked up a small, battered envelope. He held it out to Arif. "This," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "is for you." Arif hesitated before taking it. The envelope felt old, its edges frayed, as if it had been handled too many times. He looked at the old man, confused. "What is this?" The old man's lips quivered as he spoke. "My name is Hakim Khan." Arif frowned. The name sounded vaguely familiar. He glanced at the man in the suit, who nodded. Hakim Khan took another shaky breath. "Years ago, I was one of the wealthiest businessmen in this city. I had everything: money, power, respect. But I lost it all because of greed, betrayal, and my own mistakes." Arif listened in stunned silence. "My family turned against me. My so-called friends disappeared. I was left with nothing. For years, I lived on the streets, ignored by the very people who once called me their own." His voice cracked. "Until tonight. Until you." Arif swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say. Hakim gestured toward the envelope. "Inside that is my last will and testament." Arif's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a legal document, stamped and signed. He scanned the words quickly, his eyes widening. Hakim Khan was leaving everything he had left, his remaining assets, his bank accounts, and a small but valuable property, to Arif. His heart pounded. "Uncle, this has to be a mistake. Why are you giving this to me?" Hakim smiled weakly. "Because you showed me that kindness still exists in this world. When I had nothing, you gave without expecting anything in return. And that, Beta, is worth more than all the wealth I ever had." Arif shook his head. "But I don't deserve this." Hakim's grip on his hand tightened slightly. "No, son, you do." Tears burned Arif's eyes. He had spent his whole life struggling, working hard just to survive, never expecting anything in return. And now, fate had handed him something he could never have imagined. As he looked at the frail man before him, he realized something profound. Hakim Khan wasn't just giving him money. He was giving him a chance to change his life, to help his family, to build something meaningful. A deep, overwhelming gratitude filled Arif's heart. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Hakim's eyes softened. "Promise me one thing, Beta." "Anything," Arif said. Hakim's voice was barely audible now. "Use this wisely, and never lose the kindness that brought you here." Arif nodded, his throat too tight to speak, and as the machines beeped softly beside them, he held onto Hakim's hand, knowing that this night, this one act of kindness, had changed everything. Arif sat in silence, staring at the will in his hands. His mind felt clouded, unable to fully grasp the reality before him. Just hours ago, he had been a struggling cab driver, worrying about how to pay the next month's rent. Now, an old man's gratitude had turned his life upside down. Hakim's breathing had grown weaker. The doctor stepped in, checking his vitals, and then gave Arif a solemn look. "He doesn't have much time left." Arif felt his heart clench. Despite only meeting the old man hours ago, he felt a deep connection with him. He had no family of his own in the city, and for the first time in years, someone had shown him a kind of fatherly affection he hadn't felt since childhood. Hakim's eyes fluttered open once more. He looked at Arif with a tired but peaceful gaze. Beta, there's a lawyer waiting for you outside. He will help you with everything. Arif shook his head. Uncle, I don't care about this money or property. I just want you to get better. Hakim smiled faintly. It's too late for that, son. But knowing that I'm leaving something in the hands of a good man, that gives me peace. Tears welled up in Arif's eyes as he held onto Hakim's frail hand. Minutes later, Hakim's breathing slowed. His fingers loosened. And then, as a soft beeping sound filled the room, the old man was gone. The next few days were a blur. Hakim's funeral was small, attended only by a handful of people. Hospital staff, a few lawyers, and Arif. There were no family members. No mourning children or weeping relatives. As Arif stood by the grave, he clenched his fists. How could a man who once had everything end up dying alone? The lawyer, a middle-aged man named Salman, approached him after the burial. Mr. Arif, I know this is a lot to process, but we need to go over some formalities regarding Mr. Hakim's will. Arif took a deep breath and nodded. In the lawyer's office, the truth became clearer. Though Hakim had lost most of his wealth, he still had some valuable assets. A small but decent apartment in a good neighborhood, a bank account with enough savings to start fresh, and some investments that, while modest, were still significant compared to what Arif had ever known. This is all legally yours now, Salman said. But there's something else. Arif raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Salman slid a folder across the desk. Mr. Hakim left behind notes and letters. He wanted you to read them. Arif's hands trembled as he opened the folder. Inside were handwritten letters, some addressed to people who had long abandoned Hakim, and one addressed to him. To Arif, the man who reminded me of what truly matters. Arif took a deep breath and began to read. Days passed, and Arif slowly adjusted to the change. He moved into the apartment Hakim had left behind, still feeling like he was living someone else's life. The thought of leaving behind his old routine as a cab driver felt strange, almost unnatural. But one evening, as he sat in the quiet apartment, he came across one of Hakim's old journals. Inside were detailed accounts of how he had lost everything: bad business decisions, greedy partners, and most of all, his failure to value people over money. A particular entry caught his attention. I wish I had given more while I still had the chance. I wish I had used my wealth to make a difference instead of just hoarding it. If I could go back, I would help those who needed it most, not the ones who only cared about what I could offer. Arif closed the book, a deep sense of purpose settling in his chest. I won't make the same mistakes he did. Instead of spending the money on luxuries, Arif made a decision. He would use this unexpected blessing to help others the way he had been helped. He started small. He went back to the cab station and found the struggling drivers who had once been his colleagues. Some of them were drowning in debt, barely making enough to survive. Arif anonymously covered a few of their outstanding loans. He visited the poor neighborhoods he had once driven through, handing out food and warm clothes to families in need. And then, he made the biggest decision of all. He set up a small shelter for homeless people, a place where those in desperate situations could find food, rest, and a chance to get back on their feet. He named it Hakim's Home, in honor of the man who had changed his life. Of course, it wasn't easy. Some people questioned his decisions. His own relatives, who had once ignored him, suddenly showed up, asking for money. Old friends who had never cared about his struggles now wanted a share of his newfound wealth. At first, Arif felt guilty saying no. But then he remembered Hakim's words. Use this wisely. He learned to set boundaries. He helped where he could, but he refused to let greed take over his heart. Months passed, and the shelter flourished. People who had nowhere to go found hope again. Jobless men found work through Arif's connections. Children who had been sleeping on the streets now had a safe place to rest. And with each person he helped, Arif felt something growing inside him, a sense of fulfillment far greater than any wealth could bring. One evening, as he stood outside the shelter, watching families gather for a meal, he looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Uncle Hakim." A soft breeze blew past him, and for a moment, he could almost hear Hakim's voice, gentle, proud, and at peace. Months turned into a year, and Arif's life had changed in ways he had never imagined. What had started as a simple act of kindness, giving an old man a free ride, had transformed his entire destiny. Hakim's home had grown beyond Arif's expectations. With the help of volunteers and donations, it became more than just a shelter. It was now a community center where people could find food, temporary housing, and even job training. Arif had also found a new purpose in his own life. Instead of driving a cab for long hours, barely making ends meet, he now spent his days helping others get back on their feet. His name spread throughout the city, not as a rich businessman, but as a man with a generous heart. But despite the success, Arif remained humble. He still lived simply, using most of his resources to help others rather than indulging in luxury. He often thought about how different his life could have been if he had refused to give Hakim that ride. One small act of kindness had changed everything. One evening, as he was walking through the shelter, he noticed a young man sitting alone in a corner. His clothes were torn, and he looked lost, just like many others who had come through the doors of Hakim's home. Arif sat beside him. "What's your name, brother?" The man hesitated before answering. "Faisal." "You look like you've had a rough time," Arif said gently. Faisal nodded. "I lost my job. Couldn't pay rent. I tried asking for help, but no one cared." Arif smiled. "I understand. I've been there too." Faisal looked up, surprised. "You? But you run this place." Arif chuckled. "Believe it or not, I was once a struggling cab driver, just like you. I barely had enough money to survive." Faisal frowned. "Then how did you end up here?" Arif took a deep breath. "Because someone once helped me when I least expected it. And now, it's my turn to help others." Faisal's eyes filled with tears. "Do you really think I can turn my life around?" Arif placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I know you can. It all starts with one small step." As the days passed, Arif reflected on everything that had happened. He realized that true wealth wasn't measured in money or possessions. It was measured in the lives one touched, in the kindness one shared. Hakim had spent most of his life chasing riches, only to realize too late that money couldn't replace love and human connection. But through Arif, his final act had created something truly meaningful. Arif knew now that no act of kindness was ever wasted. Even the smallest gesture, helping a stranger, offering a meal, or simply listening, could create ripples that changed lives forever. And most importantly, he had learned that giving didn't make a person poor. It made them richer in ways that truly mattered. As he stood outside Hakim's home, watching the people inside laughing, eating, and finding hope again, he smiled. "This is what real success looks like," he thought. He looked up at the sky, feeling a deep sense of peace. "Thank you, Uncle Hakim. Your kindness will live on forever." And in that moment, he knew he would spend the rest of his life making sure no one was left behind, just as he once had been.